What Queen Camilla just realised behind closed doors is that a secret administrative purge can be permanently dismantled by a single unfeeling financial audit in less than 24 hours. What was meticulously orchestrated to be her ultimate takeover of the Buckingham Palace payroll became the most suffocating institutional reprimand she has ever faced. The realization was immediate and freezing as she walked into the Grand State dining room, fully expecting to host an inaugural morning briefing for her newly appointed executive staff. She had spent weeks quietly restructuring the palace hierarchy, firing the historic loyalists of the late Queen, and replacing them with her own fiercely loyal, highly paid inner circle. She expected to walk into a room full of allies who owed their lucrative careers entirely to her. Instead, the heavy oak doors opened to reveal a staggering, undeniable physical void. The grand room was entirely empty. When she turned to the corridor, demanding an explanation from the royal protection officers, she witnessed a devastating tableau. Standing at the end of the hall, perfectly composed and flanked by the exact historic courtiers she had just attempted to banish, was Prince William. Despite the crown on her head, Camilla was just brutally reminded that she does not possess the authority to write the checks of the British state. This video will unpack the secret personnel maneuver the Queen Consort quietly attempted under the shadow of the King's health crisis, how Prince William uncovered her staggering exploitation of the sovereign budget, and the silent, ruthless retaliation that followed. You will see exactly how the rigid architecture of royal finance was weaponized to execute a flawless constitutional defense, leading to Camilla's devastating realization that her 30-year campaign to conquer the monarchy stopped at the exact boundary of the royal vault. To understand the absolute devastation of this moment, we have to rebuild the staggering illusion of absolute power Camilla had constructed for herself. For 30 years, she played the longest, most patient, and most calculating game in modern royal history. She survived the intense public fury of the 1990s, methodically outlasted the hostility of the old aristocratic guard, and watched the total institutional erasure of Princess Diana's legacy within the palace walls. She slowly and carefully replaced the ghosts of the past with her own favored press contacts, her own media strategists, and her own private secretaries. By the time the crown was placed on her head at Westminster Abbey, the illusion was entirely complete. She believed she had King Charles completely controlled, and that the institution had finally totally surrendered to her will. In her mind, she had successfully transformed from the realm's most hated mistress into the untouchable matriarch of a global empire. The magnificent royal residences felt like her personal properties. The sovereign's authority felt like her ultimate impenetrable shield. This is the profound danger of surviving a long, bitter war of attrition. You begin to mistake sheer endurance for absolute boundless administrative authority. Camilla began to operate under the dangerous assumption that the entire human resources machinery of the British monarchy was now permanently structured around her comfort and her commands. She expected the blood royals to quietly step aside, assuming they were either too exhausted or too afraid of upsetting the king, to challenge her quiet administrative maneuvers. She treated the historic payroll of the crown as a personal favor bank, assuming she could freely distribute sovereign salaries to elevate her own status, while systematically marginalizing anyone whose loyalty belonged to the true bloodline. The trigger for this current crisis began months ago, hidden far beneath the surface of routine state administration. While public attention was heavily focused on the king's ongoing health treatments, a profound domestic shift was being engineered behind the scenes. Camilla recognized a stark, uncomfortable reality. Her constitutional authority as Queen Consort is an illusion that vanishes overnight the moment her husband's reign ends. Driven by a deep-seated commercial desperation to anchor her influence permanently, her office quietly initiated a highly sophisticated shadow campaign known within aristocratic whisper networks as the Palace Modernization Directive. Behind the velvet ropes, Camilla's private office began systematically targeting the old guard. These were the fiercely loyal, highly respected courtiers, ladies-in-waiting, and private secretaries who had spent their entire lives serving the late Queen Elizabeth II and honouring the legacy of Princess Diana. Under the guise of streamlining the royal household and modernising the budget, Camilla initiated a brutal, quiet purge. She drafted termination notices and forced early retirements upon the very individuals who represented the historic, unyielding backbone of the Windsor line. But the true sinister nature of this directive was not merely in the firings. It was a calculated attempt to redirect those massive taxpayer-funded sovereign salaries to her own hand-picked cronies, personal friends, and family associates. Camilla was attempting to use the geopolitical wealth of the British state to secure lucrative, permanent visibility for her own non-royal network. She was establishing an alternative administrative ecosystem designed to subtly elevate her own legacy while quietly starving the Wales family of institutional support. She assumed that by framing this shadow alliance as an order from the Queen Consort to modernise the estate, the palace human resources apparatus would quietly rubber stamp the new contracts, permanently anchoring her public relations machine into the wealth of the monarchy before the crown passed to the next generation. But she profoundly underestimated Prince William and his ironclad control over the institutional budget. This is where the story shifts from a tale of petty palace manoeuvring to a forensic, cold-blooded institutional discovery. William is no longer just a grieving son or a compliant heir waiting in the wings. As the Duke of Cornwall and the Prince of Wales, he is the active regulator of the institution's global and domestic future. Most importantly, William holds vast unchecked executive oversight regarding the financial expenditures of the sovereign infrastructure. He approaches the architecture of the institution with the cold, data-driven discipline of a modern chief executive officer. Furthermore, William has spent his entire life watching the women he loves be consumed, marginalized or isolated by the treacherous machinations of the royal firm. He watched the institutional erasure of his mother, and he has sworn a silent ironclad oath that the true historic integrity of the crown will never be hijacked by commercial desperation. When the revised payroll audits and the exorbitant new employment contracts crossed the automated auditing systems of the Financial Oversight Committee, the paper trail immediately unraveled. William did not scream. He did not confront Camilla in the grand hallways of Buckingham Palace. He did not leak angry, emotional tirades to the tabloid press. The core blood royals operate with a devastatingly analytical and emotionally intelligent restraint. When William uncovered the subtle, coordinated push to banish the historic guardians of the monarchy and replace them with hostile commercial actors, he went straight to the master financial architecture of the state. He realized that the greatest weakness of Camilla's empire is her absolute lack of independent financial sovereignty. Every ounce of her power is borrowed. She possesses no inherent constitutional authority to dictate the sovereign payroll or to allocate the royal budget to her private allies, especially against the explicit oversight of the direct heir to the throne. And so, the silent execution of revenge was put into motion. It was brilliant in its terrifying administrative simplicity. Utilizing his overarching executive authority over the financial continuity of the crown, William quietly signed a sweeping administrative directive that established an immediate institutional blockade. He completely bypassed the King's office and the Queen Consort staff with a single silent financial stroke. William legally and permanently froze the operational budget of the Queen Consort's private office. He permanently defunded and deactivated the employment contracts of every single new hire tied to Camilla's shadow purge, citing unauthorized exploitation of the sovereign treasury. But the retaliation did not stop at simply redlining a spreadsheet. To truly neutralize the illusion of her power, William engineered a visual humiliation so profound that the entire palace ecosystem would instantly recognize the shifting gravitational pull of the monarchy. He quietly intercepted the termination notices intended for the old guard and explicitly countermanded them. He permanently upgraded their security clearances and placed them directly under the financial protection of his own royal household. Which brings us back to that freezing moment outside the heavy oak doors. Camilla, confident that her orders had been flawlessly executed, arrived at the state dining room, expecting to claim her new empire and enjoy the quiet satisfaction of seeing her rivals removed. Instead, she found an entirely empty room. Her newly hired staff had not merely been delayed. They had been physically stopped at the staff entrances by royal protection officers. Their access passes flashing red because their salaries did not legally exist. As she stepped back into the corridor, the trap snapped completely shut. Down the hall stood Prince William, surrounded by the exact loyalists Camilla had tried to destroy. The courtiers were not bowing to the Queen Consort. They were looking past the current fading reign and quietly permanently aligning their absolute loyalties with the Prince of Wales. Camilla realized that William had just used the rigid, unfeeling financial architecture of the state to publicly amputate her authority, leaving her completely isolated in the hallway surrounded by an administration that she can never afford to control. The heavy silence inside the king's private quarters was not merely the sound of a marital disagreement over a palace personnel dispute. It was the sound of a 30-year alliance permanently fracturing against the immovable wall of the sovereign ledger. Camilla stormed into the royal apartments, her humiliation burning hot, and demanded an immediate audience with King Charles. She expected the man who had spent 3 decades bending the entire monarchy to accommodate her presence to finally stand up to his son. She demanded that he summon the Prince of Wales, manually override the financial blockade, and instantly reinstate the exorbitant employment contracts of her chosen inner circle. She expected him to roar, to declare that his queen was his absolute equal in all administrative matters of the state, and to fire the historic courtiers who had just stood beside William in silent defiance. But as she delivered her frantic ultimatum, the king simply looked down at the financial audit resting on his desk, his expression unreadable, and offered a devastatingly quiet refusal. He did absolutely nothing. This was the psychological climax of her entire royal existence. For years, Camilla had operated under the assumption that Charles would always prioritize her pride over the institution's demands. But the king is a man deeply aware of his own mortality and the highly scrutinized nature of the sovereign grant. Charles looked at the meticulous ironclad financial veto executed by the Prince of Wales, and he recognized the harsh arithmetic of his position. To overturn William's directive would require the king to wage an open, highly public war against his own heir regarding the misuse of taxpayer funds. It would mean officially endorsing a scheme to siphon sovereign wealth to his wife's private friends during a period of profound national economic scrutiny. He realized that the financial survival of the crown, the stability of the government, and his own historical legacy were worth infinitely more than his wife's attempts to build a privately funded court. In that freezing, unspoken moment, Charles chose the financial integrity of the state over Camilla. That deafening silence forced the Queen Consort to confront a reality she had successfully ignored since the moment the Archbishop placed the crown on her head. The staggering commercial desperation of her actual position. Why was she so frantic? To control the Buckingham Palace payroll and insert her allies into the state budget. Because Camilla fundamentally understands that her power is entirely an illusion. She possesses no royal blood, she does not own the Duchy of Cornwall, she controls no sovereign wealth. Every privilege she enjoys, from the roof over her head to the historic jewels she wears, is entirely dependent on her husband's continued survival. Her attempt to purge the old guard and hijack the payroll was a desperate attempt to manufacture actual, untouchable financial leverage that would survive the end of his reign. By embedding her cronies into the highest levels of royal administration and securing their salaries through the state, she hoped to build a permanent taxpayer-funded fortress so that she could never be marginalized. But Prince William's ruthless administrative retaliation exposed the sheer emptiness of her title. Legally, structurally, and financially, a Queen Consort owns absolutely nothing and commands no one within the Treasury. By executing this bloodless financial purge, William did not just defeat her plan, he exposed her to the entire palace ecosystem as an external actor, attempting to siphon off the wealth of the state for private gain. He legally amputated her from the true power center of the monarchy, leaving her as a purely ceremonial figurehead entirely reliant on the goodwill of a stepson whose mother's legacy she had spent her life trying to erase. This is the cold forensic reality that William used to permanently box her in. William is no longer merely the heir to the throne, he is the active steward of the state's financial survival. He views the monarchy not as a personal favor bank for his stepmother's friends, but as a billion-dollar geopolitical corporation that requires absolute fiscal integrity. He did not execute this retaliation out of petty domestic revenge. He did it because allowing an unelected, non-blood royal to weaponize the sovereign budget is a direct threat to the survival of the British state. He used the unfeeling machinery of financial audits to draw an ironclad boundary around his father, proving that while Camilla may share the king's bed, she will never be permitted to touch the checkbook of the country. This frantic, desperate overreach stands in devastating contrast to the quiet, undeniable ascension of Catherine, Princess of Wales. While Camilla scrambles to manipulate human resources protocols and rewrite employment contracts to artificially validate her relevance, Catherine operates with the supreme confidence of absolute inevitability. The Princess of Wales does not need to fire historic courtiers or hire aggressive public relations operatives at the taxpayer's expense to be powerful, because she is the future of the state itself. Despite facing a brutal health crisis and enduring immense public pressure, Catherine has never demanded financial concessions or attempted to hijack the sovereign's budget. She rests securely in her role, embodying the exact uncomplaining sacrifice and institutional dignity that the crown demands. The historical guard of the palace naturally gravitates toward Catherine, not because they are financially coerced to do so, but because they recognise her as the true legitimate continuation of Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana's legacy. William has ensured that the power flows cleanly and legally toward his wife, leaving the frantic administrative manoeuvring of the Queen Consort entirely suffocated by protocol. The subtle shifts occurring within the palace corridors are now impossible to ignore. In the aristocratic world, a frozen employment contract or a bypassed personnel directive is never a logistical accident, it is forensic proof of a massive transfer of power. The courtiers, the private secretaries, and the estate managers who once rushed to accommodate Camilla's every preference are now actively reading the room. They see the royal protection officers turning away Camilla's newly hired allies at the gates on the direct orders of the Prince of Wales. They see the historic loyalists of the late Queen standing proudly behind William, fully restored and financially protected. The staff are looking past the current fading reign and quietly, permanently aligning their absolute loyalties with William. The administrative architecture of the palace is systematically locking Camilla out, rerouting all critical financial decision-making away from her office. This is the ultimate tragic culmination of Camilla's ambition. She won the long, bitter war of attrition to become Queen's surviving public outrage and institutional resistance. But she is discovering that the crown is simply a piece of jewelry when it is stripped of the kingdom's financial machinery. She is surrounded by the sparkling trappings of ultimate majesty. Yet she has just been officially categorized as a financial liability by the very institution she sought to rule. She has definitively, permanently lost the war for true power. When the inevitable transition of the reign finally arrives, she will not be a shadow regent dictating terms to a loyal staff. She will be relegated to the margins of history, sitting in a magnificent but empty room, holding a title that carries absolutely no financial or geopolitical weight, waiting for an entourage that will never arrive because the salaries were never approved. The grand illusion has finally dissolved and the house always wins. If you found this deep dive into the hidden financial power dynamics of the royal family insightful, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment below. Let me know how you feel about Prince William stepping up to defend the crown's historic budget and its loyal staff. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next analysis.